Hi, and welcome back to the Beyond Aromatics podcast, brought to you by the National Association for Holistic Aromatherapy. I'm your host, Savannah Rose. You can learn more about NAHA by visiting our website at naha.org or by finding us on Facebook at Aromatherapy Community or on Instagram at Beyond Aromatics. All right, enjoy the show. Today we have on special guest Jah Skipper. Jah is a passionate field botanist that has worked on several conservation and ecological projects in both the Mediterranean and mountainous ecosystems to improve the plant understanding. For the past 7 years, he has taught field botany regularly in the French Alps for the ELPM Lyonnais School of Medicinal Plants. Through his experience in growing up on a medicinal plant farm, he has taken a special interest in the integration of botanical skills and knowledge with the herbal and aromatherapeutic world. We have him on today to talk about essential oil identification and how aromatherapy distinguished itself from botany and herbalistry. All right, enjoy the show. Jah, where are you talking to us from?
I'm currently in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, in a place called Taos, for people that may know it. Super awesome.
So is that where you usually are full-time?
No, I live mainly in between France, so the Mediterranean French countryside, near Montpellier and in the Ardèche, and sometimes in England as well, in the Cambridge area. And right now, I've been in America for a while, and hopefully I'll be in America for the next couple of years. So really excited to discover the scene here, the plants and the people.
Oh, awesome. And New Mexico, that's high on my list of places to visit. I love kind of the deserty area. And of course, the West Coast. I love the mountains. That's why I found myself in Idaho. So awesome place. So you're a master of botany, but you are talking to us today about essential oil identification and how aromatherapy kind of distinguished itself and maybe some of the problems that led to. So what got you into essential oils in the first place?
So I have I've had a strong interest for taxonomy and the plant sciences since I'm 15, and so more of the scientific aspect of how plants are related to each other, in the sense, a bit in the way that each species, us included, we have a Latin name, so we are, Homo sapiens, and then so you have scientists that worked on criteria to distinguish every species, and so that's my gate of entry, was really having fun with that, using the tools of botanists, which are the floras, and roaming around the French countryside trying to identify all the different plant species. And so that's how it started. That's how I got into plants. It was kind of this game of collecting and getting to recognize all the cool plants that are around me. And little by little, because the botany world is such a small one, it's a really tight community, and it often overlaps with the herbalistry world. So a lot of people that got into botany will transfer, at least in France, will also have a foot in herbalistry or farming or conservation. And so this small community kind of was a melting pot, and that's how I got introduced to start off with herbalistry. So, the use of medicinal plants. So that was really cool, because I was already recognizing all the wild plants around me, and now I could add value and usage to them. And so slowly I became a teacher from the age of 19 onwards for the Herbal School of Medicinal Plants in Lyon, which is the largest, or the second largest, I think, medicinal plant school in France. And so I was teaching on the field to just, a vast array of people, from all ages and backgrounds, how to recognize the wild plants safely before they could use them for their herbal preparations. And that slowly led me, one thing leads to another, and herbalistry is a real good gateway to oils, and so that led me to get interested in oils. And the more I researched the subject of oils, the more I realized that there was a huge amount of work to be done on the botanical aspects of essential oils, because unlike herbalistry, essential oils are highly transformed, detached product, which have uh, no botanical identification criteria left on them because it's an oil. We have, a lot of time we buy tea, we have the flowers, we have the leaves and everything, and we can do that ourselves. But aromatherapy is a lot more detached from the plant itself, and the products that they're producing aromatherapy are very, very concentrated and potent. And so the mix between the potential dangers of aromatherapy, which are very high, and the fact that the link with plants is so removed because of a transformation process, kind of has created this gap in knowledge that I was kind of shocked in seeing. And so that's really what got me into the rabbit hole of digging into plant naming and essential oils.
So you identified kind of an interest, and then you say you identified some problems and realizations to follow deeper into it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was really because aromatherapy was interesting to me. Like most people, a lot of people in botany, I would have a few oils in my house and use them for various purposes. But only quite recently did I systematically look at the supply and the quality of the botanical information and the naming information that was supplied by the main vendors. Very famous vendors, well-established people, and even within the well-established literature about how to use essential oils, because that's my mother's a herbalist and aromatherapist. I had access to all these books, and kind of haphazardly, whilst I was shuffling through this information and learning myself, I just couldn't help to be shocked at the amount of botanical and naming errors that were in these resources and in these supplies, and so what will often happen is that someone will make an error somewhere, and he's a reference, and everyone will repeat that error. And so you end up with an accumulation and also the aromatherapy world is very slow at adopting botanical updates because botany is always changing, and naming is always changing, and so that jumped out to me as a botanist. That was like a realization. I couldn't believe it, and so I thought to myself, I was like, "Wow, that's sheesh! I need to address this." And I thought to myself, I'll just write an article or something. And it's been addressed by a few people already that are doing good work and have blogs and written material about it. So I thought maybe I'll chip in and do the same thing. And before I knew it, I was 120 pages down, working down all the different issues and trying to untangle those identification problems. And it kind of grew from one article to a full-on course. So that's how I got into it.
So what are the current norms around naming and identifying essential oils, and where were some of the problems that you noticed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because as many of you must know or have heard already, essential oils, although they are highly potent pharmaceutical products, that there's an incredible amount of concentrated molecules in there. In most countries, they qualify as a supplement or a cosmetic, and so the naming and the identification process that goes with essential oils is that is often linked with supplementation and cosmetic rules. So depending on your country, that will vary. In America, it's obviously the FDA that handles that side of labeling and identification, and they have a website you can go and see, and they have the accepted common names, accepted Latin names for each oil, and kind of very loose guidelines. But really, the main kind of reference point that is leading the way on how it is acceptable and how an oil should be identified and named is done by the ISO, so the International Standardization Organism. So they're NGO. For those that might not know about them, they're an NGO that kind of group technical committees of various natures. So it could be government agencies, private people, experts, scientists, whoever is an authority in the domain and wants to be involved can be, and then they vote upon standards and rules, guidelines at least, that they deem fit to ensure that products are up to the standard that they should be. So for the essential business, there are two main guidelines which are really interesting for anyone that's buying, using, or dealing with essential oils. Be it the person like me just buying a few oils for their family, or the guy or the person that's running a business and that wants to buy a huge amount of oils. They have two guidelines on naming, which are really interesting. And so the first one is called Essentials Principle of Nomenclature, and it was released in 2014. And so that's kind of the rules that they establish on the minimal naming that should be required with an essential, with its bottle and its packaging and its marketing material. And so they state very clearly within their standard that you should have the common name should always be included. The Latin name, so the botanical name that we'll speak about maybe further later, should be included if there's no common name. That's an issue I find quite important. And then obviously the part of the plant, how it's extracted, the geographic origin. So basically, they set guidelines for the minimal information that is required to be given to the client to ensure that they can distinguish between oils. And then they have a second list, which is just a list, and it's called Essential Nomenclature, and that was released in 2014. This one is freely available, I believe, and they reference all the accepted botanical names, so and the associated common names that are accepted for each main essential oil species. So that's really good material. But although those guidelines these guidelines are quite recent, but they're iterations of much older guidelines that date back 30 years ago. So there's already been an effort for the last 30 years to establish an international standard for naming of essential oils. But despite that, because the rules are so loose in many countries, such as in America, you find yourself with some of the biggest vendors not following them. So it means that us, the clients, we're buying highly potent aromatic products that could be very powerful at healing us, but could also be a bit dangerous a lot of the time without all the information to make sure that we are actually getting what we think we are getting. And that's the issue that I'm trying to address, and the tools I'm going to try to bring up for anyone, to avoid that problem. And so maybe that was a bit of a long answer for the question, but.
No, that's great. And so you have, so I want to kind of know a little bit more, like common name, your rosemary, and then your botanical name, your Rosemary officinalis.
Yeah.
And so why is that just not enough, or why is that not quite accurate?
Yeah. So what I'll propose is I can break down what I've identified as a main problem. So imagine you come, a lot of the times, this will be more kind of lower end distributors. Nowadays, even in America and in England, big distributors have picked up, and they're including Latin names, but there's still a hell of a lot online of distributors that are not including Latin names. So imagine you arrive and you want to buy, let's say, rosemary essential oil, as you just said, and you see the description and it just says rosemary essential, and you're like, all right, great, well, that's exactly what I want. I know I want rosemary, right? Where would the issue be for you? Well, the issue lies that without the Latin name, first of all, there's more than one species of rosemary. Although Rosemary officinalis is the main one that we distill, other ones are distilled, right, in the Middle East. So that's already an issue. You might be getting a totally different species, and the reference books you use to establish a pathology or a treatment for your kids may not apply for the other species. So the common name on its own is not giving you that information that the Latin name would give you. So let's assume you do have a Latin name. So you have rosemary, and the distributor says, all right, well, it's Rosemary officinalis. It's like, all right, great. Well, here I'm safe, right? Well, no, because rosemary, like many other plants, especially in the Lamiaceae family, in the mint family, has many chemotypes, right? Mm-hmm. So, for those who don't know, basically a chemotype is a chemical type within the same species. You can have a chemical constituent kind of profile of your species that differs enough and is stable enough in its differences for it to be named in a different way. Initially, the chemotype was defined by the first most concentrated molecule. So let's say, if you had, cineol as the most concentrated molecule, your chemotype would be cineol, right? And if you had borneol as the most concentrated, it would be borneol. But the thing is, scientists realized that the chemotypes, sometimes you could have just a tiny bit, the second molecule could be tiny bit higher than the first one, than the commonly first molecule, but then everything else is very similar. So the difference between the oils is actually not that high. So in that case, the chemotypes is misleading. So what they're doing now, there's no real standard way of defining a chemotype. Unlike botanical name, where there's a rule that's accepted worldwide, chemotypes is kind of a subjective thing. We use them in essential oils, and they're really powerful. But the downfall of chemotypes is that there's no standard rule for it. But right now, the direction it's going is that scientists are using these algorithms to quantify differences and stability of the constituents, and then they name a chemotype, and that's much better because, as I said, sometimes even if your first molecule is different in concentration, it's not the same molecule that's the most concentrated, you could have a very, very similar oil. So there's no real, it's not really valid. But so coming back to your question, you have the common name of rosemary, great. You have a Latin name, great. But the vendor doesn't tell you the chemotype. And so now, rosemary, off the top of my head, I think there's 4 main rosemary chemotypes, and they have drastically different use cases. So without the chemotype, you're asking for trouble again. So all right. So now you have a chemotype. That's really good. Well, in that case, I would say that that's a safer bet. You have everything you need. You have a common name that labels you to easily identify what you're going for, because everyone knows common names. You have a Latin name to ensure that you're not confusing it for another species that carries the same common name, which happens a lot. And thirdly, you have the extra chemical information of a chemotype that tells you which chemotype you're dealing with, so you're not using the wrong one for your kid's skin, Mm-hmm. So that's the thing. But the thing is, so many vendors are, even massive ones. I mean, I looked at some of the biggest oil sellers in America, often omit to put chemotypes or geographic origin when it's very, very important. And so that can lead to massive issues.
Well, can you give us some specific examples of essential oils that it really could be a problem without correct labeling?
Yeah. So one typical thing, right? I lived quite a bit of my life in France, and I'm half French. And so when I was studying herbalistry and everything at the herbal school, they often recommend, the internal use of essential oils is very common in France. It was developed mainly in Europe, Western Europe, and the French were pioneers in it. And in France, it's quite accepted that Eucalyptus radiata could be ingested orally, even for kids at very small doses, or inhaled. So, but a very common, just as common eucalyptus that's on the market, Eucalyptus globulus, which has a different safety profile, is much more irritating for the mucus and is not at all recommended for internal use, especially not for kids. What bears the same common name a lot of time, So that's when the Latin name is essential, because, hey, I read somewhere online, I read in a book, eucalyptus is awesome for throat infections, colds, coughs, whatever. I'm going to treat myself and my family with it, And you go out there and you find a bottle of eucalyptus and you buy it, and it's awesome. But, there's so many eucalyptus species, first of all, and the common name is used for both globulus and radiata, are both commonly named just eucalyptus on the bottle. On the marketing, if you go on the internet, you'll find that everywhere. Well, without the Latin name, you're running the risk of creating severe irritation to your throat and your kid's throat. So, a safety issue is real if you don't apply the Latin name properly in this case. This is just one example, but there's many.
So what about geographic region and maybe part of plant? Are those important to add into the labeling aspect?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So it's such a rabbit hole, this is, because it's crazy. Well, because without going too into detail, the thing with geographic origin is that the ISO, so I spoke about ISO, and I studied the ISO quite a lot because I think this is going to be a revolution in the way essential oils are named and identified, and what's going to happen on the market is kind of what you look at what's going on in the ISO will kind of happen 10 years after in the market. And so the ISO are really have been identifying geographic types, stable geographic types of oils. And so they characterize them based on physical, biochemical characteristics that are stable enough and accepted by the community, by the scientific community, to be different. And so that's awesome, because what it means is that, we obviously know, in the aromatherapy world, everyone knows that, let's say, Indian sandalwood, from India is different and maybe seen as superior than the Australian's Indian sandalwood. Santalmor album from Australia, is often marketed as more sustainable because it's cultivated and not wild harvested. But a lot of people that are into perfumery and using essential oils for whatever reason will prefer the Indian one because it hasn't got quite the same constituents, the same smell, the same properties, right? And so that's a well-known, established fact. So the origin in that case is going to often be included with your oil, because in the community, us as consumers, people are looking out for the Indian one, right? But right now, the ISO, as I was rambling on, the ISO is identifying a ton more of geographic types. And for instance, right, like people that are passionate about rose essential oils, they'll know this, but a lot of people don't know this, that there's 4 stable and identified geographic types for rose. Bulgarian, for damask rose, right? Bulgarian, Turkey, Morocco, and Turkish peasant type. And so that's what the ISO's done. And it means that now, because we have a standard reference of value and property for each of these geographic origins, the people that are working with the oils and defining properties, and the scientists that are also working with oils, have a higher degree of detail within the variations within the same oil. And that means that us as consumers that will mean that we'll have access, hopefully, down the line, once these geographic types are very well defined, we'll have specific use cases and variations for them. And so it's a kind of a circular argument where geographic origin is important and has been given if people know about it, but there's so much that is unknown. Like, for instance, basil essentials of origin is not very well marketed, although there's so much variation in the chemotypes and the origin of the basil. And so I'm confident that, and I'm hopeful that as we define more and more geographic types, we'll have, as clients, more and more information about the origin of the oils, and it also be available, also enable us to use them accordingly, according to their distribution. And so coming back on the same question, there's a whole different aspect, more pragmatic aspect, where the ISO, they say that on their principle of nomenclature guidelines, they state that a Latin name is to be given if no common name is accepted for the plant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they don't say that it's like a necessity to have a Latin name, although I think that it's very useful and it should be included, and it is included, which is good. But they also say that if a plant has the same common name, which happens a lot, right?
Right.
You have to distinguish it by its geographic origin, just as you pointed out, as you hinted in the question, so that we know that we're not dealing with the same species. So if we have, Spanish helichrys and Italian helichrys, that Spanish will be referred to as Helichrysum stoicas and Italian as Italicum. All right. But the problem I see with that is that there's a big flaw, because many species, just like the eucalyptus, they grow within the same country, like Australia. Their centre of diversity is Australia, right? So if we follow the ISO's recommendation on naming and origin, they say, well, if you have the same name, just use the geographic. It doesn't apply for Australia and eucalyptus, because they nearly all come from there. So what they've done is they've just applied different common names for each of the main essential oils. But the problem with that is because there's no rules about common names, no rules about valid and unvalid common names. And common names are so different according to which part of country or even the world you are and what language you use. That opens up a huge dilemma. So the origin should be given, but it should never be given, in my opinion, without the Latin name. So that's where I diverge from the opinion of ISO, and I honestly think that it is only with a combination of common Latin name, origin, intraspecific epithets such as varieties, cultivars, hybrids, and chemotypes that we can have a safe way of picking an oil. Because really, the ISO's recommendation, in my opinion, is not precise enough. And, I'm getting a bit geeky and technical about it. And obviously, buying essential oils is a fun thing, but there's a lot of subjective aspects. Do I like the smell? Do I want this in my house? Do I want to wear it? It doesn't have to be all technical, and it doesn't, and it's so a balance has to be found, because not everyone has a passion for botany, and not everyone's going to take the time to double check everything, right?
Right. That was going to be my follow-up. I'm like, what like level of importance do you put all this at for somebody who's running kind of a business? And how do you simplify it, or how do you make it so that everybody can try to meet these standards for of course, for safety reasons? But what's your work around this?
Yeah. So I think the main takeaway really, like, if you're running a business and you're buying and selling oils, I think you can't be too careful and can't be too informed, because right now the essential market is exploding. There's I read somewhere recently while I was doing my online course, there's something like a 25% increase in domestic use of essential oils in projected 10 years or something like that. It's ridiculous. So a lot of people and a lot more oils and diversity of oils are available on this global market. So back in the 70s and all that, when the first people were really starting to sell oils in mass, there was way fewer oils, and the people that were interested in oils were a much more select group of people that may have already been in contact with herbalistry, botany, and other aspects of the plant world, and that were more specialized in a sense. And now I think it's a great thing. What's happening is there's a democratization of natural remedies, of alternative therapy, and aromatherapy is one of those ways that people are seeking for a different way of healing and preventative care. But this leads to a lot of new people that have come in through the perfume route, the emotional, kind of relief side of aspects, and even through brands. A lot of people have been pulled in through different brands that attract a lot of people towards essential oils, and so they haven't had the same intellectual journey to get interested in essential oils. And it's just they're just as legitimate as anyone else. But the thing is, there's a lot more people and a lot more diversity of people interested in essential oils. So as a wholesaler or someone that's running a small essential business, for instance, the market's changed so much. And as I said, there's so many new people. I think it's really important that you become really, really aware of the potential dangerous confusion that may arise, and of all the different technical aspects of the oils on the naming and identification side, but not only on other aspects such as the proper chemical identification, the proper testing to avoid adulteration, and so on, and ethical aspects of it as well. On all the main aspects, which will be naming, ethics, conservation, sustainability, and so on, and health. Just because it's your role, really. You don't want to. Someone comes in and just asks you an advice and buys a random oil and goes back home and takes too much of it and damages themselves and their family. It's not optimal. So, and for the personal use cases, obviously, the more you use oils for a specialized task, and the more your oils are used within a higher risk manner. For instance, if you're curing acute illness, chronic illness that are quite severe, or if you're using them internally, or if you're using a lot of oils, then you're exposing yourself to a higher risk, right? It's much riskier than if you're just using them for perfume, house cleaning, right? So according to what degree of risk you're taking in your use of essential oils, how you integrate essentials in your life, I believe that will define how far you'd be required to get, the knowledge required to really identify my oils clearly. Because, right, I was teaching, just a little segue, I was teaching botany since I'm 19. I've been teaching botany to herbalists. And so, but despite, giving them all the tools, even I've got all the books, I've spent my whole life, however short it is, studying botany, but I'm still prone to making mistakes, right? And I remember one specific case. I was doing this walk and we were going through all these plants, and I said, we're going to have let's try out our botanical skills and all harvest safe to eat plants. And I said the names, and we'll have a salad and we can eat them afterwards and speak about their properties. And so I was sifting through the baskets as the students came back. And one of the students, had picked Digitalis purpurea instead of Xanthium officinalis, purple digital instead of common comfrey, which is a deadly mistake, right? And so I could show him straight there how to recognize the differences in each of the plants and not do that mistake again. With the essential world, we haven't got the plants in our hands. We're not herbalists. We don't go out and pick. Some of us might distill plants, but a rare amount of us really distill plants. These plants that come across the world that have been highly transformed. They come in a packaged and branded bottle, and there's a disconnection with the plant world that, that can lead to issues. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. However, technical it might seem, really the takeaway for someone using oils, and especially, as I said, in a specific way, is that they should always be very aware of a common accepted Latin name, geographic origin, and any chemical variation within that species. And that's a minimum. You cannot, in my opinion, you cannot allow yourself to use oils in a very, medical type of way if you're not 100% confident that you can reliably identify them. All right. So it's the same with plants. You can't eat plants. I tell my brothers, don't eat this plant. And my little brother, he's young, he's around, he's nibbling at all the plants, right? He can't, it's not good for him to just try any plant without knowing how to recognize which ones he shouldn't eat, because he's putting himself in trouble. And that's the same thing with essential oils. But the insidious part is because it's so transformed, and the issues that you get from misuse of essentials are oftentimes chronic and can be misidentified. Then we don't get the immediate feedback of like, shit, I didn't use the right oil, or shit, I did a mistake. Oh, this is not right.
So not only are you into essential oils, but you're a conservationist. And I was wondering what the potential hazards are for naming and conservation.
Yeah. So on Earth, there's about 300,000 to 400,000 vascular plants, so plants that have a vascular system. Anything from ferns upwards, mosses and algae don't have a vascular system, but there's 400,000. And out of these 400 or 300,000 plants, vascular plants, there's about 3,000 commonly distilled for their essential oil. So there's only a very small subfraction of those plants which are commonly distilled for their essential oil. And within those 3,000 commonly distilled essentials, there's only really around 300 which are globally traded at big quantities. And so this means that there's the impact of essential oils on conservation, because of the small amount, the tiny little subsection it represents in the global diversity of plants, could be argued to be lower than herbalistry, because herbalistry we're using way more plants, and oftentimes we do a lot more wild harvesting, whereas essential oils, a lot of them are cultivated. But how does naming fit in with conservation, right? Well, the thing is, if you don't have, right, so some plants, for instance, a good example that I always bring up because I love it, it's the example of rose, right? Damask rose. Everyone knows damask rose. It's an amazing oil, smells amazing, and it's been around for thousands of years, right? But the thing is, damask rose has a very, very complex botanical origin. We name it, the accepted name right now in Latin is Rosa X damascena, right? So there's a hybrid because there's an X in between. So we agree that it's a hybrid. But scientists that looked into it have realized that there's actually not probably not one hybrid, but what we call one hybrid is a complex of several hybrids, right? And so what that leads to is, let's say you have, this is hypothetical, in what we call commonly rose essential oil, there's actually 4 different hybrid origins. Right now, there's not enough definition and enough stability in how we recognize them, so we're not sure. So we're just using that one name, right? Rose is mostly cultivated, so it doesn't really apply. But let's assume, for this example, that rose was wild harvested, like a lot of the wood essential oils are wild harvested. Well, because we're only using one name, all the roses that are within that name, although there might be 4 subpopulations, one of which might be dwindling and near extinction, are fine to be harvested, because we say, hey, look, there's a huge natural distribution of rose. There's a load of them, right? And so it's not a problem. They're not endangered, right? But actually, because we haven't got enough resolution in the name of a rose, we didn't realize there was actually 4 different things in that, and one of them was about to disappear, and we're still using it a ton, right? And so,
right. Wow.
Yeah. And so that happens a lot more in the case of herbalistry, because there's a lot more plants, so it's much more likely to happen. But one thing relating to conservation as well, not necessarily just the biological conservation of a species from extinction, but also the phenotypic and chemical conservation of species. If we don't have a proper naming and understanding of the variations and the stability of these, be it geographic type or chemotypes, then what might happen is that we, as essential producers and consumers, we're just kind of we're omitting that diversity, and we're blending it all. So first of all, we're using different things in the same way, which is not optimal. And secondly, we might be cultivating them and mixing them up, and getting them to hybridize and diluting their singularities and their stability, rendering the chemical differences, which is also a form of diversity, much lower. That often happens when we cultivate plants. We often, one of the side effects could be reduction of genetic diversity. And so because we cultivate a lot of essential plants, that's another conservation aspect that's very rarely spoken about, but in my opinion is quite significant.
That's so interesting, because I guess I just never considered that aspect of it, and how it seems like there's just layers and layers on this, and which might kind of intimidate some people, I guess, at this point, or maybe inspire some others to be more prudent about what they're buying or what they're doing. But
yeah,
what do you see the future of the industry in aromatherapy with labeling? Do you see it as getting better and more solidified in how it approaches it? Or do you kind of see that because now it's growing so much that it's growing a little too fast to kind of regulate that way?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think there's a bit of truth on both, I think the fact that it's growing so fast and the fact there's this kind of economical boom, a lot of people are profiting from essential oils or anything related to essential oils, that's kind of diluting the it's kind of making it harder to regulate, because there's so much. It's just like this explosion. It's just like how when a similar thing that's happening right now is, I guess, the electronic cigarette thing,
Oh, yeah.
It's this new, it's exploding so fast. Regulatory bodies are kind of having a hard time to catch up. But on the other hand, I think that because since the 1980s to now, there's been an explosion of scientific articles treating essential oils and their properties and the toxicology and whatever. So there's never been in the history of science so much work put into understanding essential producing plants, their molecules, and how they work. And so that, in that sense, just like how I tried to say it, maybe I'm rambling a bit, but in that sense, that information that scientists are gathering is going to trickle down within legislations and then down to us, the consumers, So it's kind of a circular thing where really, because we have way more information about oils, we're now able to more stably distinguish geographic types, chemical types. We're also much better identify potentially dangerous oils and so on. And so we have like a better vision. We have a better understanding. As years ago, we're growing really fast in our understanding of our objective understanding of how oils work and their benefits, their risks, and how they relate to each other. And so that I'm confident that in the future we'll see that, and we're already seeing that through the ISO, because they're doing a huge amount of work standardizing a ton of species and a ton of geographic types, although it's not finished, And one thing that I think might happen in the English-speaking market, that's already happening in the French-speaking market, is that because that we use more and more chemical data hand in hand with the botanical name, common name, and origin to anchor the name of the oil, right? So now every time you go into France, I think every single oil, I don't know if it's a rule, I haven't looked it up, but every single oil I bought in France for the last year, on the packaging, they always have at least the first, but sometimes the first two most concentrated molecules within that batch. And so that's amazing, because to me, right, the main difference and the main challenge linked to naming essential oils, and that's made it hard until now for us consumers and for the legislation, is that an oil is not a one-to-one of a plant that it comes from. When you name a plant, it has its letter name, that's it, right? Well, more or less. But an oil, you can produce so many different oils from the same plant, according to, as we said, where it's from, what chemotype, and also the cultural way we distill it, the extraction method and everything, the cultural surroundings around that oil, where it was extracted. Although it's the same plant, it'll produce radically different oils. And that's where the gap between naming really lies, is because we're not naming the plant anymore. We're naming a very small subsection of its aromatic molecules, which can vary according to culture, origin, and so on, as I just said. And so that, in my sense, that would be my desired future, the ideal future for essential identification, is that we integrate more and more chemical naming along with, the botanical naming. Because the downfall of botanical naming, as I said, is that we're not naming a plant, we're naming an oil, and that's different. And that's where the gap is, that's where the problem lies, in my opinion.
So this might be a little off subject, but I wonder what the implications are for researching the benefits of certain oils. If you see that there are gaps in some research, that some people aren't doing their due diligence to say that, oh, this oil is good for this and this, if it varies so much by chemotype.
Yeah. So if I've understood correctly, what you're asking me
if you notice gaps in research because of the lack of looking at chemotypes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And more than that, the thing is, researchers, they are also in a bit of a pickle, because, they come along with a lot of essential plants have highly been modified and transported and hybridized and have crazy origins, and humans have been using for so many years that a lot of research come along, and because the identity of a plant is so unstable on its botanical, sense, like citrus fruits is a really good example. All of us love neroli or petit grain, right? Mm-hmm. But because the taxonomy, like the way we understand what each species is so unclear, within the scientific literature, you also get a ton of that transcripts into the scientific literature, but because, unless you have a clear identity of what you're studying, then you might end up, studying a small subsection of it, totally the wrong plant, and that ends up creating problems. And also, within the same idea, and speaking about problems in scientific publishing and within the essential market, there's also a huge, it's a growing industry. So there's also quite a lot of lobbying going on, whereas, large essential companies and countries will lobby towards recognition of one chemotype over the other, or will lobby towards the conservation of one name against the other, because, that's really important to their economy. So that's always a problem in science. And I guess it's not an exception in essential literature either.
So, leading on that, what kind of takeaways do you have for maybe consumers and maybe aromatherapists working with clients and maybe even just retailers or wholesalers that could possibly help them in their business or just in their daily usage?
Yeah, well, I think the takeaway really is to, as I already said, is to identify whoever you are, whatever you're doing, is identify the amount of, the degree and nature of your use of essential oils. So if you're now a therapist, you are paid to treat people, and I'm sure and I'm hoping that you have a very solid and deep understanding of oils, probably much more than I do. And so that will be a requirement for you to understand not only what they do, but even before that, how you can identify them. Because if you know what an oil does, but you can't fully reliably identify which one does, which one it is, then that causes a problem. For wholesalers, it's the same thing. You're kind of responsible. You're putting not only your reputation, but you're also in some cases getting legally bound to how you are advertising, the amount of information you're providing, and the amount of errors that might induce. And so I've recently been involved in helping people set up a shop and look at their botany and their inventory and the naming behind the oils, and it's not an easy task, and I understand that, and sometimes it's a bit daunting. But just like anything, if you want to become a great artist, you have to go through a boring process of learning the technique of it. It takes hours. And I guess if you want to become a reliable aromatherapist or a distributor, or if you just want to use them reliably in your family for real medical purpose, then I guess, this is just my opinion, but it would be wise to become accustomed to the basic techniques of identifying the best oils and the right oils reliably,
Well, and you might even have some options to help people, right? Do you offer a class or a course with all
Yeah,
this?
I do. Yeah, this is my first ever course. I've been teaching for a while, and I love teaching. And so this is my first ever course. It's an online course, and it addresses not only naming, which was a very specific, very detailed talk we have today, but it englobes all the major aspects that one, as a buyer, whatever level of buying you're doing, if you're doing wholesale just for your family, you may want to consider, and all the different techniques, tricks, and tips that you can derive information and value from what's given to you as a consumer. So that goes from, obviously, as we said, naming, but it also touches a lot on the whole chemical aspect, so the testing, the reliability of different testings, how to use the standard values provided by the ISO to test the tests that are provided, because there's well, I could go into detail, but and it also goes in depth, because this is my expertise on how and to identify sustainable oils from non-sustainable ones reliably using the most relevant tools that are available to us. And so really, it holds your hand, and it's a really comprehensive course that takes a bit of time to go through. But I would hope, and I believe, will really enhance the way you see and buy oils. It certainly changed the way I see oils. It gives you that security that what you're buying, can never be 100% sure. But with this course, I believe you can be as sure as you can be without doing tests yourself on the oils.
That's awesome. And where else can people get in contact with you or find out what you do?
So if you guys want to see what I do, you can find my course at aromatherapy.com. That's the website it's hosted on, and really that's where I am at. That's I've got a Facebook group within the course, and that's how they find me. I haven't been very good on my social media, so
it's for the best, really.
Yeah, and so I'm offering. There's currently a 20% discount on my course for whoever might want to take it, and the discount code is JAHNAHA, so JAHNAHA, and so if you log that in, you should get 20% off. But anyway, I hope the talk helped, and if you're interested in more, there's a ton of really good articles and books out there. And there's also, my resource. So definitely check it out.
All right. And thank you, Josh, so much for taking the time today to sit down and talk to me and talk everybody through this. We hope you are interested in speaking at the 2020 conference. I'm sure this would be really interesting to a lot of people that come there. So I'll have to get you a speaker application before it's all said and done. So
yeah, that'd be awesome.
Thank you again for being around today. And thanks everybody for listening. And we will catch you next time on the Beyond Aromatics podcast.
Thanks a lot.